My name is Dr. Jonathan Rynhold, and I'm a lecturer here in the Politics Department at Bar-Ilan University and a researcher at the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. I research and write about political culture and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I'm writing a book at the moment about that subject, about American attitudes and European attitudes and discourse. I'm also very involved in combating the campaign that is trying to delegitimize the state of Israel. I've been involved in combating the academic boycott of Israel in Britain, and I've been involved in other parts of Europe and in the United States in helping the foreign ministry develop their strategy as to how to combat this. And so it's through that I come to speak to you today a little bit about Western attitudes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the ideological divide. Now, when we generally talk about the West, we normally make a division between America and Europe. And that's right. There's no doubt that you can say that America is much more supportive of Israel than is Europe. It doesn't matter which country you pick in Europe. And people will say, well, why is that? Well, there's tens of millions of evangelicals in the United States. There are more Christians in the United States that believe God gave the land of Israel to the Jews than there are Jews in the world. So that's clearly a factor. And if you look at Europe, people will say, look, well, there's much more anti-Semitism in Europe. And if you read an article, if you're good at statistics, you can read it in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. You can read an article which will show, yes, those people with the most anti-Israel attitudes in Europe are indeed the most anti-Semitic. But it would be a mistake to put all of America on one side and all of Europe on the other side. And particularly when we're facing an international or transnational campaign to delegitimize Israel, we need to look at the fact that our supporters in Europe and in America speak the same language, make the same claims. And our enemies, both in Europe and in the United States, speak the same language and make the same claims. So when we are tackling this problem of trying to understand what is going on, why do people think like they do, why is an idea more popular in one place than in another, and how do we counter it, I don't think we should divide between Europe and the United States. I think we should look at different ideological approaches that are shared throughout the West. And what I'm going to argue today is that there are four different approaches, ideological approaches in the West. If you read the newspapers, if you do surveys, if you talk in focus groups, there's a mainstream conservative approach, and that's the most pro-Israel. There's a secondary or minor conservative approach, which is linked to old-style conservatism, Toryism, the old right, which is hostile to Israel. The most hostile group to Israel is the hard left, what used to be Marxist left or postmodern left now. And the big group in the middle, which is either neutral or critical and a minority or supportive, are the liberals. And the liberals are the biggest group, and they're the ones that are going to be most decisive in this whole battle about Israel's legitimacy. And if we want to understand, I'm going to argue, why it is that America is much more friendly to Israel than Europe. It's not simply because there's a Jewish lobby. Believe it or not, there's a Jewish lobby in plenty of other countries. And it's not simply because there are evangelical Christians, because you know what? Even the least supportive groups in the United States of liberals are more supportive than your average European. It's because America is exceptional. It's because America is different, not only in the way it relates to Jews, but its whole political culture. Okay? America is a country which is liberal with a capital L. Even conservatives in America are liberal. To be a conservative in America is to believe in the Constitution, which is basically a liberal constitution. In America, there are two groups that are very weak compared to Europe. The old right, old-style conservatism, okay, and the new left, and the post-Marxist, postmodern left. And this goes back all the way back to the founding of America. If you look at American political culture, the radical left and the old right have always been peripheral, and those are the places where hostility to Israel is greatest. What I want to do now is take you on a little ideological tour of all these different approaches so that we can try and understand what drives them to look at Israel in a positive or negative way. And then at the end, if there's a little bit of time, I'll try and explain to you how this plays into the whole attempt to delegitimize Israel. And then there'll be hopefully be time for half a question, okay? Ma'arav, what is the West? The West is those countries which are liberal democracies, which is primarily the United States and Europe, but also includes former colonies of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, South Africa, etc. Okay? Okay, who's the most pro-Israel group? The most pro-Israel group are mainstream conservatives. In America, you call them neoconservatives or American nationalists. They make up the Republican base. And in Europe, there are people like Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, Berlusconi in Italy, newspapers in Britain like the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail. And for them, their conservatism, as I said to you, is like the classical liberalism of the 19th century, belief in individual rights. And they have a very robust sense of national identity and of belonging to the West. Western values, liberal democracy, that is the best way. And they think that there's a big divide between those people who believe in these things and those people who do not believe in these things. And in President George W. Bush's words, you need in the world, strategically, a balance of power for freedom. That is, when we think about what's good for America, what's good for the West, the more countries we have that are Western liberal democracies, and the stronger they are against those countries which are not, the better. And so when they look at Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, they see a small country, which is a Western liberal democracy, which is in the front line of a battle against radical Islamism, which to them looks very much like fascism and communism, just with a religious language. For them, it's refighting the battle of 1938 at Munich. It's refighting the battle of the Second World War. It's refighting the Cold War. And to give you a sense of this, I'll quote, not from an American newspaper, but from a British newspaper, from the Daily Telegraph, writing after the flotilla incident in which they supported Israel. There is no middle ground in this war. Political leaders in the West must decide whose side they're on, the defenders of freedom in the Middle East or the forces of terrorism and tyranny that threaten them. Israel is on our side. Israel is on the front line. We must support it. And it's very telling that their support for Israel rose after 9/11 by quite a significant margin. In other words, a lot of the reason they support Israel is not necessarily just to do with who we are, it's where we are and what our fight is and who we're fighting against. They also see Jews, and by extension Israel, as part of the West, constitutive of the West, something that makes the West what it is. The West is based on a Judeo-Christian civilization, and particularly the Bible. And of course, the Bible talks about the Jews having a homeland in the land of Israel. So you don't have to be an evangelical Christian to believe that this is the Jewish homeland. It's part of our, in inverted commas, Western tradition to believe that the Jews belong here and they have a homeland. It's natural to think they have historical rights. So you take John Adams, one of the founders of the United States, writing in the early 19th century, goes, oh, I've got a good idea. Okay? 70 years before Herzl, the Jews should return to their homeland. You know, that would be a good way to solve anti-Semitism. And, you know, that is their historical homeland. Natural, he wasn't an evangelical Christian. The thing is that this, as I explained to you, this approach is much more popular in the United States than Europe. You've all heard of Charles Krauthammer, right? The Washington Post columnist. How many of you have heard of Melanie Phillips? Okay? So Melanie says the same thing, but she doesn't have a column and is not held in the same esteem as Charles Krauthammer. And that gives you an idea of the differences. The old right. In America, they're sometimes called paleo-conservatives. In Britain, they're sometimes called Tories or patricians, the aristocratic wing of the Conservative Party. And they're mainly interested not in values, not in democracy, not in the West, but in maintaining their position. maintaining their power position, their economic and social order, which benefits them. And so what interests them in the Middle East is oil. That's what interests them, access to oil. And they think basically that Israel is a card that you pay for oil with. You want good relations with the Arabs, you want good relations to the Muslim, you pay in Israeli or Jewish, depending on what year or what person we're talking about, coin. Okay? If we get Israel to make concessions, then they'll give us an easy life with terrorism, then they'll give us an easy life with oil, then we won't have any problems. And that is their main outlook. There also is a residual anti-Semitism there, because their outlook is based on an old aristocratic outlook, and you tend to find, although people, it's not polite to be anti-Semitic anymore, as you know, you still find people talking about Jewish conspiracies, cabals, lobbies. You find things slipping in, particularly when people get a little bit hot under the collar, and you see these things coming up again. And what's very interesting about this group is if you trace their origins back to the 1930s, these are the people who in the 1930s supported appeasement. Okay? Ideologies don't count. We want to maintain the order as it is. Democracy's not that important. As long as the Germans stay in Europe, who cares? So if we looked in England, who were the main supporters of appeasement? There was a big group of conservative Tories. And who in America? The isolationist Republicans. If you've heard of Mearsheimer and Walt, who wrote the book The Israel Lobby, this is them. This is their group. They're much smaller in America, so you might not have heard of them. But they're out there. And what's very interesting, these are the people who supported Munich in 1938. We'll pay in Czech currency this time. Hitler will leave us alone. We give him what he wants, appeasement. And what's interesting about this group in the 1930s is, who were their allies? Their allies were on the hard, radical, Trotskyite, communist left. And if you look now, if you read these American conservative journals, or you read the radical left journals, you will see that a strange thing happens. These Tory conservatives and these Trotskyites are praising each other and writing in each other's journals. This is an unholy alliance. And the buckle that holds it together is anti-Zionism. Not just anti-Israel, not just anti-Israeli policies, but anti-Zionism. Israel is the cause of all our problems. If we break away from Israel, everything will be all right. So who are the main group behind the attempt to delegitimize Israel? And why are they doing it? Well, I call them the post-colonial left. They're a group of people who are Trotskyites, the new left, people who were vehemently against the Vietnam War, the postmodern left, the Greens, peace movements, certain NGOs. We heard people who Gerald Steinberg writes a lot about, and people who in the mainline or Protestant mainline church in the United States campaign for divestment against Israel. And what's their outlook? Well, if I wanted to sum up their outlook, okay, it would be like this. White ain't right, and strong is wrong. Israel is white, Israel is strong, therefore it is wrong. Okay? These people take the old Marxist idea of classes. The working class have to have a revolution against the ruling classes, and they substitute for the first world and the third world. The first world is Europe and the West. It is evil. It is the ruling class. It must be replaced. Israel is a colonial white outpost, yes, of this. The Palestinians are dark-skinned from the third world, therefore they are right. It doesn't matter what they do. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes just so that you can realize just how extreme this is. One comes from the editor of The Guardian, one of the editors of The Guardian from 2002 talking about racism, and one comes from one of the leaders of the academic boycott against Israel in the UK. Here's the first one. White people need to accept that no matter how many anti-racist demos they've marched on, they inevitably make assumptions which are influenced by a racist society and which help form their views. As a black man, I am bound to suffer prejudices, but I cannot be racist because in the global order, I do not belong to the dominant group. First quote. Second quote. From the standpoint of Marxism and international socialism, an illiterate conservative superstitious Muslim Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas is more progressive than an educated liberal atheist Israeli who supports Zionism even critically. Got it? Got it? There's nothing you can do, right? We are the wrong class. We must be wiped out. It is a historical necessity. And did you see the parallel? Yeah? Blacks can't be racist because they are the third world. Israel can never be right because it's part of the ruling class. Now, this sounds strange to us, and we wonder how it is that this thing could become popular, which I want to come over to in a minute. But before that, I just want you to get a sense of the full extent of what we're talking about. Famous journalist, originally Australian, works out of Britain, John Pilger, sees Islamism as a positive force in the world because it's anti-imperialist, anti-American. So at demonstrations against Israel, you have, we are all Hezbollah now. Yeah? Hezbollah are the good guys because they're fighting Israel and the United States. But it's not just about ideologies. Particularly on the far left, there's a left anti-Semitism. And we're often blinded because we think the left stands for universal values and all this sort of stuff. How could they be anti-Semitic? But if you look back all the way to the 19th century, you see there's always been a strain of anti-Semitism in the left. And one of the ways it comes out most strongly is on the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. Most of these left-wing people, if they saw you being beaten up by a skinhead on the streets of London, would come and help you. They don't hate Jews per se. But for some reason, only Jews don't have a right to self-determination as a people. And this is called the new anti-Semitism. Okay? And what it means is, you look back, many of the early communists and Trotskyites were Jewish. Trotsky was Jewish, right? And they were arguing against Zionism. And so they managed to say, they had to say, well, why am I not a Zionist? So they said, right, all the other nations in the world have a right to self-determination, but the Jews are beyond that. The Jews can go straight to socialism and internationalism and communism and all the rest of it. And that filtered into Soviet propaganda, and that filtered all the way into radical left ideology, and then including comparisons to the Nazis that came out of the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And so you can have a mainstream play in Britain, 7 Jewish children appearing in the West End, which basically compares caste-led in Gaza, yeah? Palestinian children in caste-led in Gaza to Jewish children in the Warsaw Ghetto. It basically compares Israel to the Nazis. And this is mainstream and this is acceptable. And this is where we start to get worried. Because actually, how many people do you know who would agree with the first statements that I made? The Trotskyite hard left, a progressive Hamas. Very few people. But the problem is that this minority of people, they may be limited in number, but their influence is limited to influential people. Academics, writers, commentators, people at The Guardian, at the BBC. This is what they read. I went to be interviewed on the BBC. A book, Israel as an Apartheid State, is on the desk being read by one of the people there who's a researcher. And again, sort of softer, more liberal, fair-minded, woolly people, yeah? They would say, well, of course I don't agree with that. But there's kind of what I call a Lubavitcher Rebbe effect, which is, there are many people who are religious or not religious, but say, well, I'm not that religious, but that's the real thing. And I think that's wonderful, but it's just not for me. Well, I think there's a Chomsky Rebbe effect. Noam Chomsky and all these people. Well, I know that's a bit extreme, but, I also, that's what it, that's the pure form, and I'm just sort of, more gentle, but that's what really is right. That's what really counts. And what these people do, and what they're very clever at doing, is blurring their real agenda. So most of the time, they don't talk in the language that I just put before you, which is very clear and direct. Israel doesn't have a right to exist, and whatever happens, happens. What they do is they take issues of humanitarian concern, which may bother many Israelis, They bother many people in the West. We can agree or not agree, but they're legitimate issues for debate. Roadblocks, settlements, how much force is legitimate. And what they do is they take one of those words, which we all can have a debate about what's right and wrong, and we won't end up delegitimizing Israel if we disagree, we'll just disagree. And they attach a word that demonizes Israel. Roadblocks becomes apartheid. Disproportionate force becomes war crimes. Settlements become ethnic cleansing. And in doing that, they blur the distinction, and they manage to increase their level of support among liberals, so that a third of European public opinion will agree that Israel is an apartheid state in an ADL poll. A third. Okay? Now, it's a casual poll. That doesn't mean they're out there, waving the flag every day. But what it shows is that a very small group of people have been very successful at taking over the language and blurring it and making people go along with things that really, even from their own point of view, they shouldn't go along with. So I did a search of where I took the 5 leading newspapers broadsheets in America and the 5 leading broadsheets in Britain, and I looked, where does the word Israel turn up near the words racist, apartheid, or colonial, right? Not just I don't agree with this and I don't agree with settlements, delegitimization words, demonization words. 95% of it was in 2 British newspapers, The Guardian and The Independent. And what's worrying is, originally, these comments were in the mouths of Palestinians. Gradually, they became contested terms in the mouth of the columnists. And more recently, for some of the columnists, it's become accepted, and it's ha 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 on you if you don't realize that. So who are the last group? The last group are the liberals. And the liberals make up the bulk, liberal with a small l, not necessarily party political. Liberals believe in freedom of the individual, human rights, reason, moderation, diplomacy, trust, economic integration. Yes, to national identity, but a soft form, maybe like the European Union, maybe like NAFTA. And these people were very, very supportive of Israel and Zionism before 1967. They were supportive because of justice after the Holocaust. The Jews deserved a homeland. They were supportive because Israel was a democracy. And you have to remember that there were only 2 countries in the whole of the post-colonial era that have been democratic all the way through, Israel and India. So it wasn't just, well, like now Israel's one of many democracies. It was this little country of Holocaust survivors that managed to be a democracy. It was something that was looked up to, very much so. And then after 1967, this group has been in favor of what we call the peace process. Yes? Territorial compromise or a 2-state solution. Gradually over time, they've become more and more critical of Israeli policy, the First Lebanon War and the First Intifada, because they don't, and they've come, what I would say, is to support the Israeli left, and oppose the Israeli right. Now, what happened in 2000 was the liberals split. The majority of liberals said, well, the peace process failed, it was faults on both sides, and continued to think as they had done up to that point, which means that they continue to support the Israeli left and what they see as pro-peace Palestinians, and they oppose the Israeli right, and they oppose Netanyahu, etc. But a minority of them, an important minority, people like Tony Blair, refused to condemn Israel in the Second Lebanon War and paid for it by losing the leadership of the Labour Party. That more than any other issue, more than the Iraq War. Paul Berman, if you've heard of the American academic, Bernard Henry Levy in France, Jeffrey Goldberg in America, Pascal Bruckner, also in France, not all Jewish. Tony Blair's a Catholic. So these people said, no, the conservatives are right. It's a battle for liberal values. It's a battle of democracy. And Israel is on the front line. And of course we want peace. And of course we believe ultimately there's got to be compromises. But if we allow Israel to lose to Hezbollah, We will only have to fight Islamic radicalism later on, and it will cost a lot more lives. And so the battle now for Israel is over these liberals. That is the battle. And the battle is not only to mobilize conservative pro-Israel support, but to prevent the radical left pulling over the majority of liberals towards ideas like boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And in Europe, the situation is pretty bad, and in the United States, it's much better, but it's the same fight. It's the same fight. And some of the things we have to do is take back the language of why Zionism is not only something right in Jewish terms, but it's something right in liberal terms. We have to also show the human face of Israelis. We talk about Israel, the Israeli government, and the Palestinians. Well, most soft liberal people want to hear, are more interested and more sympathetic, less to governments and more to Israeli citizens who have to live under fire, or Israel's difficult dilemmas. What do you do when you have rockets firing on you? Again, it doesn't really matter if they agree with every single policy of the government. The important thing is they realize these are really difficult decisions and it's legitimate. Okay? There's a difference between legitimate and agreeing with all policies. Another thing that's very important to do is to give people a positive alternative to boycotts and divestment of Israel. One of which is support something that does something good for Israelis and Palestinians, like Israel has a charity, Save a Child's Heart. Kids from all over the world, including the Arab world, come here and they have transplants for free and things like that. Those sorts of things resonate. I can't overestimate you how important this is. Israel is a country whose economy is global. A campaign throughout Europe, which is Israel's biggest partner, economic partner, to divest from Israel, to have sanctions against Israel, which would gain government support in those countries, would cause major problems, very serious problems for Israel. The good news is that this is actually something that can be fought relatively easily, because it only takes a few really dedicated activists to get out there and fight it correctly, and you can have a really big influence. How do I know this? I look at the other side. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for 1.5 questions, if anyone wants. Ken? If we look, the question is, do I see chances of a boycott for Israel? The Trade Union Congress in Britain and the Trade Union Congress in Ireland, which have millions of members, including the 60 million people in Britain, a union with 2 million members, they all support a policy of boycott, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. If the vote goes through in the UN in the General Assembly in September, and if the wording of that is bad, then it will kick off a process where there will be lots of attempts in all different sorts of institutions, in courts, trade unions, all sorts of places. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in 2 years. But we could be at a tipping point, and it's very important to fight the battle now on ground which is relatively good. Peace process. When there's a peace process, it takes the air away from the radical attempt to delegitimize Israel. But the problem is, if peace works, all the delegitimization will go away. When peace doesn't work, it comes back with a vengeance. So in the 1990s, it was very quiet. There was a big attempts in the 1980s, quiet in the 1990s, but it came back with a vengeance in 2001, because underneath, these people had been working away. And if they can make their narrative that it's all Israel's fault because of settlements, because Israel's colonialism, whatever, resonate, then every time violence starts, for whatever reason, we get the blame. So a successful peace process will kill this dead. But even those who are very supportive of the peace process, like Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, and Ehud Barak, think it would take, and this was in the 90s when they were optimistic, 20 to 40 years for things to stabilize after an agreement, which means that we'll be in for a rough ride any way you cut it. Yeah?
What is
Right.
And this is so hard to understand.
Right. What they're trying to do is create a situation where governments look out of their window and what they see is a public which supports divestment and boycotts. Now, a public itself can't do that much, yeah? If 1,000 people don't buy something in Sainsbury's in England or in Walmart in San Francisco, it's not going to make a big difference. But if governments look out their window and see this, and meanwhile the Palestinians take something which calls for boycotts and sanctions to the UN, where they've got a built-in majority, even though it's not legally binding, there will be a political weight that will say the easy thing to do is to go along with this. And if governments then go along and then slap sanctions on Israel, then they think that that will cause great difficulty to Israel, economic sanctions, and will put enormous pressure on the economy and will cause Israel over a longer period of time to collapse. They also feel that the Goldstone report and things like that are very important because what they do is create a situation where when Israel uses force to defend itself, it's guilty until proven innocent. And what they want to do is create a situation where Israel has to be under constant rocket fire, okay? And it will be in a situation where it won't be able to respond with sufficient force to stop that fire without facing more sanctions and the rest of it. So that's the aim of what they're trying to do. And it all starts with the language. Because if I say, that Israel is an apartheid state, and if I say what I did at the beginning, that means it can never be just and never be right, okay? And so that's where all that comes from. And the attempt is to say it in a way that could be more widely accepted. And the name of the game is to expose that these people are not, never mind that they're not pro-Israel, they're not Democrats, they're Islamists, they're Trotskyites. They're against the very values that are the mainstream of Western society, and exposing that, showing that these people support Hezbollah, showing what Hezbollah is all about, that is something that can really make a difference.
That's exactly what Israel is not doing all the time.
Well, I'm trying.
No, I'm not speaking to you, but in general. That is exactly what Israel, that's what I just said as well. Israel is always defending itself when something happening, but you have to be active, and you have to proactive, you have to expose these things to the public. That's one thing what should be done much more concentrated from Israeli point of view.
Okay, so just...
I don't not blaming you, Mr. Rynhold.
Okay, just, I'm on the last thing. I'm sorry, I'm going to just say one last thing, and that is, you're right, but this is not something that the Israeli government can take the lead on. It's got to come from us, from civil society, because the threat comes not from governments. Governments are good at dealing with governments. They are not good at dealing with NGOs, trade unions, and public opinion. That is where civil society comes in. The group that will affect the mainline church is the synagogue next door that goes in there, looks them eye to eye, and says that you are calling me a racist because I support Israel. That is difficult to deal with. Mr. Netanyahu or Mrs. Livni going to the trade union conference, not going to make a difference. It actually has to come primarily from us. The government can facilitate, but it can't do it on its own. Thank you very much.